My name is Sumaya. I work at ARC Southeast as the Healthline Education Manager, and this series has been really important in order to connect reproductive justice to imperialism abroad. I am pulling from tactics from the Palestinian Civil Society's movement for BDS, and one of their strongest tactics is anti-normalization. This series is meant to keep encouraging us to learn more information and stay aware so that we can act accordingly. When it comes to Sudan, 12 million people that are displaced is not a normal thing. All of these atrocities are not normal. And so it's really important for all of us to stay informed and be able to tap into these community organizations. I am going to allow our panelists to introduce themselves. Daha, you can start us off.
Happy to. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Doha Madani. I use she, her pronouns. I am proudly Sudanese. My father is from the agricultural lands near Wed Medini, and my mom is from the land of strong women in Atbara, which is famous for its railroad systems and like that big city inflection point. Very similar to where I live now, which is Atlanta, Georgia, which is also, again, place of transit and how Atlanta kind of grew into where it is now. I was raised in Greensboro, North Carolina, in a very large Sudanese community. My kind of body of work has been really around nonprofits. I co-founded a Muslim women-led grassroots advocacy group based in North Carolina. I currently work for an environmental justice nonprofit here in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm honestly just a normal Sudanese person who has really been trying to raise advocacy and raise awareness, right? I'm not like a political historical expert, and I hope that you all recognize that you don't have to be in order to advocate for Sudan. And so I'm so happy and grateful to just be in this space with Salome and Saad, who are a wealth of knowledge, and I will allow them to introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. My name's Salome. I'm based here in the U.S. South. I come from East Africa, particularly South Sudan and Uganda. And I'm an organizer who align myself with movements that are committed to African people, particularly movements that understand that imperialism is the enemy. And how I do that is right now I am the co-lead for political education at an organization called Sudanese Resistance Front. It's a collective of folks committed to resistance, attempting to pursue the demands and the liberation of Sudanese people. And I am also the co-founder of Real Liberation Collective. It's a group that hosts monthly screenings in Metro Atlanta in order to advance critical discourse, political education, collective action through African cinema. Overall, invested in the liberation of African people everywhere.
Thanks so much. Can everyone hear me? Okay, amazing. My name is Saad, and I'm truly honored to be on a panel with these comrades. They are both so brilliant, and just what an honor to be a part of this. And thank you to Sim and Ark for the invitation. My name is Saad, and I am a Sudanese American human rights lawyer. I was born and raised in Hasahisa, Sudan, which is a village in the east near the Jazeera region. I am a movement lawyer. I support activists throughout the U.S. South, and I also started a advocacy collective of Sudanese Americans called Decolonize Sudan. At Decolonize Sudan, I document abuses within reports and articles. I create educational materials and lead advocacy trainings throughout the U.S. on Sudan and how to organize and advocate strategically for Sudan. Thank you so much for having me.
No, thank you so much for being here. So as also our kind of surprise panelist, she was able to make it work last minute for this panel, and so we're so grateful for each of you to be here. If we can get started with some of the questions, I know you all have a wealth of knowledge to share with us. I'm also going to put in the chat that we will have a Q&A session at the end of this discussion. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and Marie will start collecting those. In order to get us started, I'm thinking that we can start with the history. What are some key events that mark Sudan's fight for liberation and shape the current genocide in Sudan? What are some, major history points you want our audience here to understand?
Sure, I can get us started. I can get us started. And please, Salome Saad, fill in my gaps. So, really, kind of to provide kind of like some framework, a lot has happened in an extremely short period of time. So, I will say, even just as kind of within my own family, right, it has been very difficult to try and understand like what is happening. So, we could honestly start the story in like 1956, like independence from British colonial rule. We could also start like, much earlier or much later than that. 1989 is important because it is when Omar al-Bashir, through a military coup, essentially became dictator of Sudan. Prior to that, in 1983, the September laws came into effect, which made Islamic Sharia law the law of the land. A lot of people were not a fan of that. Sudan and kind of like the issues within Sudan are really unresolved questions of national identity. Like, this is a place that has a lot of tribal diversity, a lot of religious diversity, regional diversity, as well as just power and wealth hoarding. A lot of that comes from British rule. Omar al-Bashir became dictator of Sudan and went on a tirade of violent repression of popular movements, dismantling trade unions, and really pushing Arabization and like a very specific like view of Islam. With that, the US implemented genocides on Sudan. In 2003, Bashir armed the Janjaweed and committed the Darfur genocide. And there has been a lot of messaging that people have gotten about the Darfur genocide. Al-Bashir effectively armed the Janjaweed, who then restructured into the RSF, which is the Rapid Support Forces, in 2013. There were over 2 million people who were killed in South Sudan and 300,000 people killed in Darfur and millions of people displaced. There was a peace agreement in 2005, and South Sudan gained their independence in 2011. And, I think there's a lot that can be spoken in terms of like reproductive justice and just the ability to like raise a safe and sustained, family in community, because unfortunately, like that was not the case. And depending on your religious belief, depending on, your tribe, that was like, yeah, not possible. And I will just say really briefly, like my dad was actually raised in Darfur, and a lot of his upbringing and like personal experiences were really like affected by that genocide. Then kind of like moving us a little bit forward into 2018, during this like, time period, there was like a lot of just repression in Sudan. In 2018, things really came to a head. Basically, like for food, people were unable to feed their families, unable to survive with inflation and the effect of sanctions. At the end of 2019, Bashir was ousted by his own military, which is the SAF. A popular and high-ranking general under Omar al-Bashir is al-Burhan. This time period was a time for hope for Sudanese people, thinking things might potentially be different. But then during this time of a transitional government, civilian political forces were undermined by military security. And when we talk about that military security, that is where Hemeti or Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo comes in. This is someone who was a leader in the RSF, and Omar al-Bashir legitimized the RSF. In 2021, we see a military coup that completely dissolved a civilian cabinet, saying for quote unquote security purposes, these two people, Al Burhan and Hamiti, are now rivals. And there was for a brief point in 2022, kind of like an intention to return to some kind of transitional government and to integrate the RSF into the SAF. And you can understand that that did not happen. And then in April 2023, war broke out between these two parties. What we see now is due to that, nearly 2 years, more than 2 years later, there are like millions of people that have lost their lives, millions of people who have been displaced and have left Sudan. And even now, the RSF is still, I just checked on the news earlier today, there's just has been a lot with Al Fashir in Sudan. And, I think what I kind of glean from this, and then I'll allow our amazing panelists to speak, is that there's a genuine like lack of just baseline understanding of like what's happening. And I think in Sudan, and then also different people have different ideas of what a liberated Sudan looks like. And I'd love to hear from our panelists again. If I forgot anything, tap in. But that's kind of the history of where we are today. And we can certainly provide more resources.
Thank you so much for that, Doha. Salome and Saad, if you have pieces to add to that, please feel free.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Doha. Yeah, I think it's good there's so much to cover with this, and part of it requires deeper study after this session, right? But I want to take us back, like all the way back in Sudanese history, thinking about, so before colonization, Sudan, just like when we're talking about Western Sudan, where like the Sahel regions are right now, or we're talking about Sudan, where we're at all across the Sahara, there's all sorts of trade taking place, right? So Sudan, like the rest of Africa, was not inferior. This idea that we see Africa as like always inferior, always dependent, was not the case. That came into play through the slave trade, through the making of this full capitalist system, which transformed the economic relationships that were taking place into dependent relationships, where then the powers that now become in charge are Europe, and then following World War II, it's the U.S. And then they create all these institutions that Africans must now depend on, like the International Monetary Fund, which controls a lot of what's available in a country. And of course, colonialism as well. To talk about Sudan's history of uprisings, one of the places I like to start is thinking about the Mahdist Revolt. This is a revolt that took place in 1881, and it was this anti-imperialist struggle against Ottoman Egyptian rule. It brought together peasants, it brought together all sorts of exploited groups, it brought together village communities, craftspeople, etc. But what ended up happening is that towards the end of it, it got captured by elites. And this is a similar story. So this, what I'm talking about is 1889. And then we're seeing a similar pattern today. And so when we go back to the timeline, when we look at the history of Sudanese uprisings and suppression, we gained independence in 1956. But a year before that, that's the start of the first civil war in the South. And the way we gained independence, it's different than a place like Kenya, which fought with arms for independence. Ours was won through conversation, through meetings, through a contract, a colonial contract, in which the power was left into a particular elite group in Khartoum, and the colonial institution stayed. So the same army, that's the colonial army, is the same army. You have all of the same policing systems. You have basically all of the same institutions, right, following independence in 1956. And then you have a military takeover from 58 to 64. And then you have another mass uprising in 1964, a popular uprising that started due to a shooting of a South Sudanese student at the university. And then you have a transitional government. And then you have another military takeover regime. And then another uprising in 85. And then you have the transitional government of 85 to 89, which then led to Bashir in 89. And so if you look at this pattern, right, from 89 to 2018, 2019, that's when you have the popular uprising. And that popular uprising was then captured by elites. captured by the military, right? And then we have this current counter-revolutionary war that's taking place. And so during all this, like in the South, there's the first Civil War, you have the Second Civil War, and then in 2011, you have the secession of South Sudan, which, given we're in a repro space, Hillary Clinton likes to say she midwifed South Sudan, right? The reason they wanted South Sudan was because of oil. They're not interested in South Sudan because of people or anything wholesome. They're interested in exploitation. And so, even before the time of Bashir, in 1979, Chevron confirmed that there's presence of oil in Upper Nile. This is now part of South Sudan and South Kordofan. Numeri's regime reaches an agreement with the International Monetary Fund, and this monetary fund, they work with the World Bank. They develop these economy recovery programs, which required a lot of policies that include privatization and liberalization of trade, bank credit restriction. So then the country becomes owned by these international financial institutions. And we talk about the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. These are all institutions controlled by the US, right? And this led to a lot of mechanized farming schemes and a lot of push for cotton production, right? So like the interest was now all export led. Everything you make is for the purpose of exporting it. So we only want you to grow cotton because that'll make us money. We don't care about you growing food to feed yourselves, right? And this benefited the elites. And so when we talk about Sudan, we have to think about what are the economic relationships taking place? How does this system impact people's ability to live, people's ability to raise their families, people's ability to connect with one another? Part of the British colonial plan for the Sudans included creating two Sudans from the beginning, right? So the way that Sudan was administered, South Sudan was treated as very similarly to the rest of East Africa, while Sudan was treated differently. So a lot of the institutions they would build up would be in Big Sudan. If you're in South Sudan, you couldn't cross over to Big Sudan without a lot of different passes. You also have so many restrictions in terms of language. They made sure that the religion was divided in a particular way that was binary cookie cutter. They also cultivated this idea around like which tribe is which. And when you look at censuses, with 1 year, it'll say X amount of tribes. The next year, it'll say X amount of tribes because it's a way to organize society and to divide and conquer. It makes it easier to conquer that way. The policy of dividing Sudanese people has been a policy since colonization. What we have seen in every popular uprising is folks moving beyond that, different groups coming together. And it starts with hunger, right? Each of these movements have started with the fact that people are hungry, people need bread. People are working 3, 5 jobs in order to buy basic things. And so the IMF austerity measures, it also comes with cutting social services. So we're talking about things like healthcare, right? Like access to particular medications, access to particular operations, et cetera. We're talking about cutting those things, cutting the state-sponsored social services for the purpose of building up whatever it is the IMF wants, right? And then you have these NGO groups come in. And now these nonprofits, the NGOs, are now the ones that are there to take care of these things that the state is supposed to be taking care of. And so this affects healthcare, affects food, affects access to clean water. And what this led to is a fluctuation of the economy, and it didn't recover. Like between 1977, 1983, the account deficit, it rose, right? And foreign debt more than tripled. GPT per capita declined. So folks like livelihoods are expanded for the purpose of exploitation, for the purpose of profit. And this is just like one example of how it's happened throughout Sudanese history, right? And part of what this process too is, I mentioned before that there's uprising, there's some type of elite capture, et cetera. But also what happens is this formula. I'm going to share the article after I say this. But there's this formula where you secure a ceasefire. You say, we need a ceasefire, right? The ceasefire is secured. The second step is then you have interim power sharing among armed actors. And then you roll out a timetable saying, oh, we need security economic constitutional reforms, and then you bring in civil actors in order to do elections. And this is the same weapon that they've used when it comes to South Sudan, when it comes to Sudan, when it comes to every other country, right? Like, and the contradiction is, how do you share power with these armed groups as a civilian? You have the vision for the country, but you yourselves are not armed. That in itself is contradictory, it's contrarian, right? And then when you lay out these timetables, it moves the people's demands, the demands that folks are saying, hey, this is the Sudan we want to live in. This is what we want to have. This is what's needed. This is where we want our focus to be. Then it changes into focus on debt relief that's mandated by the International Monetary Fund. And then they say, oh, now we need democratic elections. And democratic elections is democracy on their terms, in whatever serves the interest of the US. And so I'm gonna pause there. Yeah, I'm gonna pause there for now.
So you can go ahead, or we can also talk about how throughout these movements and revolutions that Salome and Doha have mentioned, Sudanese women have been really pivotal. And if you could touch a bit on that too, that would be amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much to Salome for weaving this very complex and intricate history of Sudan into this condensed period, and then for Duha for going into the Bashir regime onward and the beginnings of the Janjaweed militia. I'd like to talk about the most current events from that period onward. That requires talking about what the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces militia, is. It's a private militia force that formed in 2013 by recruiting many of the fighters within that Janjaweed militia alliance that Bashir had created and given weapons to. This lord named Hameti, who made his way working up the ranks within the Janjaweed, creates his own private corporation. It's a transnational corporation called the RSF. This private militia goes on to be contracted for counterinsurgency campaigns throughout the Middle East and North Africa and Europe. The EU contracts the RSF they are mercenaries. Their business enterprise is killing. And so the EU contracts them to kill migrants trying to get into Europe. Italy also contracts them to kill migrants, use deadly force on migrants trying to make their way through boats into Italy. The Libyan former military commander contracts them to come in and massacre during the Libyan protests. And Saudi Arabia contracts the RSF to massacre Yemeni people. And so it grows and grows with these transnational contracts to come in and act as mercenaries. In 2019, when the revolution was at its height in Sudan, many protesters had congregated to the presidential palace, at which point Bashir contracts the RSF to act as his private security and massacre these protesters that were in that square, and continues to utilize the RSF as this mercenary force that is supplemental to the military. In 2021, as Duha mentioned, there was a coup to overthrow Bashir, and this was a US-backed coup, when the US facilitated the agreement for military, essentially martial law, transitional period in which the military would take over. Within this agreement, it was stated that power would be transitioning to civilians in 2023, in April 16. A day before that is when the RSF laid siege to the entirety of the country in an unprecedented manner, in a way that never has occurred in Sudan before. The key military bases were overtaken. Khartoum itself was invaded for the first time. All institutions, including all major hospitals, all schools, all vital infrastructure, grain factories, water facilities, were completely destroyed in a very systematic and strategic manner. And many people were confused about this because this was, a somewhat smaller militia force. How were they able to do this in a matter of months? They were able to undertake the largest forced displacement in modern history. They were able to create the world's worst humanitarian crisis in a matter of months. This was, now we know, with evidence by UN panels, with evidence through journalistic sources like Reuters, AP News, and others, that the UAE played the majority of the role here in giving this militia weapons, funding and fighters. And the UAE, in return, the UAE was able to extract gold en masse and other minerals and also agricultural products, because the UAE doesn't have any gold mines. It's a desert, so it doesn't have access to a lot of agriculture. And so it's able to subsist and live in a society of luxury only through its theft of Sudanese resources and of other African resources. As recently, there were many deals for extraction of resources from Congo and other places throughout Africa for the UAE. And throughout this, the US remained the main ally of the UAE. It's the major defense partner of the UAE and the main weapons provider to the UAE. So the weapons go from the US to the UAE to Sudan. We delineate this kind of clear line through our boycott and disrupt toolkit, in which we get into the particular actors and companies involved within the weapons trade and the gold trade and supply chain throughout that. I will stop there. I think we can get into especially like the US's role since has been extremely insidious. It's been one of being a public peacekeeper and mediator whilst instigating all of this and providing the weapons for all of this. I'll end there. I would say around the role of women. So women have played a vital, so throughout this, the survival of people because of the institution collapse has depended almost solely on the women of the society. The women of the society are able to put together community kitchens, put together sources of food, of gathering, and of support within neighborhoods that are not receiving any support elsewhere. And so our women are really keeping the people surviving throughout this extreme devastation.
Thank you so much, Saad. That is such a key piece to understand, is that whenever people ask why is gender lens important when discussing war and genocide, is because women are at the forefront of having to provide for people throughout the whole violence and caring for their community. A lot of mainstream news outlets will call this a civil war within Sudan and try to frame it as something that is super complicated, and it is hard to know who the bad actors are, and it is also just something that is constantly ongoing in the African region and just really normalizing these atrocities. Can somebody speak to why that is problematic and harms people's perception of Sudan and the current war?
I can get us started. I'd love to hear more from Saad and Salome, but I think you kind of named it even in your question, Sumaya, of like this idea that exists that African nations and African peoples just have this inherent like they can never get along, right? Or like there's always constant warring in Africa. And that is, I think a function of, imperialism and kind of white supremacy and many of the Western powers, if not all of them, benefit directly from both destabilization, right, but also war in general in Sudan and across African nations. And so it's not surprising, and I will say with Sudan in particular, as Saad has named and as Salome has named, we see multiple nations benefiting directly from displacement, war, destabilization, a government not existing in Sudan, similar to many other like African nations.
And what we're seeing is, if it's okay, I kind of want to like talk a bit about some of the organizing that was taking place. What we're seeing right now, it's the counter reaction to that, right? It's folks who are not interested in the liberation of Sudan, instead want to continue the same pattern, backed by the imperialist forces who want that same thing. They also want to continue that pattern. Tea Sellers Association, they were one of the strongest forces within the uprisings in 2018, 2019. And something that I want to highlight is so many of these groups that we saw participating in this popular uprisings, it didn't start in 2018, right? Like many of these groups, like officially, they started, like the resistance committees, they started in 2010, 2011. They emerged for different reasons. Some of them emerged because to fix potholes in their neighborhoods. Some of them emerged as like women's feminist groups. And like there's different groups of these, right? There's like the super affluent communities. There's also the not so wealthy ones. These are the folks that organize the protests. And many of them in 2010, 2011, this is when secession happens, right? During the secession of South Sudan, like a lot, like the overall quality of life in all of Sudan shifted. So what happens in one Sudan impacts the other. So we cannot talk about big Sudan without talking about South Sudan as well. There was a call out for folks to create their own resistance committees. There were over 3,000 that were active in 2019 to 2021, folks that were self-organizing amongst themselves. And something that was said in the Khartoum State Resistance Committee is the revolution is the people's revolution. The authority is the authority of the people. The military belongs in the barracks, and the Janjaweed is to be dissolved, right? And so I'm highlighting this also to say that we like to see the spectacle of movement, the people, when folks have done the parts that have already been getting done behind closed doors for a very long time, right? This was years in the making, decades in the making. And it's so important for us to have that also so that we don't romanticize. Like they shut down the country for 58 days. The airport, all planes were grounded, all shipping ports to the Red Sea, which is the Red Sea is why they want Sudan so bad. If we look at a map, I'm a starting geography student. If we look at a map where Rafah and Port Sudan are, right? Palestinians resisting genocide are being pushed into the southern city of, we're being pushed into the southern city of Rafah, border of Egypt. Just as soon as people running from war were pushed to Port Sudan, right? This was, I think, last year. And when we look at this on the map, the Red Sea is one of the greatest export ports that are there. We can't ignore the economic interests that are existing here. So much of the organizing in Sudan historically has been led by women. When I talk about the Sudanese Tea Sellers Association, if any of y'all have been to the continent, like these are folks who sell tea on the streets. These are folks that sell all sorts of stuff on the street. These are precarious workers that are usually not seen as folks that are part of trade unions, but they were 20,000 strong by the time of these struggles. They were having different meetings in different neighborhoods trying to figure out creating a people's charter for Sudan. What is the Sudan that we want? What do we want it to look like? Doing it in languages where folks can actually understand, like where everybody participates in spite of your education level, etc. And so what was taking place was the people of Sudan reclaiming Sudan, right? But then what ended up happening is that the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, they took all of that energy. And part of it also came from the compromise of folks that decided to compromise, right? Certain elites that wanted to align themselves away from liberation. And so I wanted to highlight that to show kind of like what was taking place, like this guerrilla warfare that was taking place. This thing where you have an entire train of folks coming from Atbara, like to join the movement, where they're creating their own societies, right? And so yeah, I wanted to highlight that point and also to talk about people create the type of society that they want and what's happening when we talk about this as a counter-revolutionary war, then like we are able to say, okay, what was the revolutionary perspective of the uprisings that took place? I, for one, don't think it reached the level of revolution because to say something is a revolution, it takes years to even determine if that's what's happening. But it was a popular uprising that could have turned into that. But it was counteracted by these forces with the support of the US, who pretends to be neutral, but actually is not. If we're thinking about reproductive justice, why do we party and celebrate by these warheads, by these people that Hillary Clinton, under like when Obama was president, bypassed all this legislation so that they can continue funneling weapons into South Sudan so people can fight themselves? Where children who cannot afford a $2 shirt have AK-47s. What do we make of that as a movement? when we can party and celebrate with these same people that are killing African children, that are making war, that are the funders of the war. And if we want to talk about where we should put resources instead, the first question we should be asking ourselves is not where the resources are going, it's how did we even get this? Whose blood is on these budgets that we're even looking at and talking about? And how much more killing is required for that to continue? Like the US is only capable of death. This is a country that's been at war since its inception. The existence of the US requires it to stay in this manner, right? And so if we claim this country, right? If we continue to lay claim to it as a legitimate entity, then that means we cannot stop the wars. Like point blank period. If we continue to see it as a legitimate, as a thing that must continue.
Suad, I'm wondering if you can continue on that train of thought about how reproductive justice has been impeded in Sudan through the U.S. imperialism and how the war on bodies has transcended borders. I do also want you to speak freely, and I also will give a trigger warning for SA. I think it's really important for us to hear this information, but also please take care of yourself if you need to.
Thanks, Sumaya, and thank you for that. To touch on, I mean, all vital infrastructure has been destroyed in Sudan with the destruction of all of the healthcare industry, any access to reproductive care and resources has been cut off. So I would say that's a major, every aspect of life has been devastated and impacted. Reproductive care has been one of those that impact. Like you alluded to, sexual violence has been the one of the key tools of war that the RSF has deployed. Systemic, there's many reports and testimonies that talk about the unspeakable atrocities of systemic sexual violence, not only against women, but against men as a tool of control and as a tool of degrading the people has been deployed by the RSF and has been reported on, but reporting in Sudan, there has been a great lack in reporting on what is happening. One very vital thing that I missed talking about is that the RSF has now shifted into the strategy of taking over the west of Sudan. And as Salome pointed out, if you look at a map of Sudan's resources, like in Sudan, in the south, it's very clear the intentions of why certain regions, imperial forces are wanting. In the south, this was a lot of minerals and a lot of primarily oil reserves. In the west, it is of many minerals, including gold and including uranium. And it's also the greenest region in Sudan. And so agricultural wealth is to be the land itself. They want to control the land itself for agriculture. And part of that control means massacring and displacing the indigenous population. The US's role in this, like I said, has been an extremely insidious one in which, just to back up a little bit, in the 90s, Bill Clinton imposed a sanctions regime on Sudan, terrorism sanctions, and this devastated Sudan's economy for 2 decades. It was only until there was a power vacuum in which that transitional military martial law entered into that period when the US swooped in and made the normalization agreement with Israel. And that's when sanctions were lifted, contingent upon that normalization with Israel. So they utilized that power vacuum period to do that. And recently, Trump reimposed and actually has escalated sanctions on Sudan, now unilateral sanctions, which have affected every aspect of life to an already extremely devastated society. Unilateral sanctions, we don't talk about enough, are a form of warfare against not only a government, but against the civilian population primarily. Sanctions are impeding any imports, access to aid, greatly affecting prices of goods because of the sanctions on banks and banking, the lack of access to banking systems. And of course, the US recently put Sudan on the immigrant ban, a red list, prohibiting all immigration from Sudan within the middle of the largest forced displacement in modern history. And throughout this, the US has facilitated what it's been calling peace talks. And what peace means in this context is that the RSF essentially would take over the West. The RSF itself is not a governing entity. It is a deadly mercenary force with no popular support, and it only operates because of its foreign backing. If the foreign backing were to stop, it would cease to be able to operate. Most of its fighters are composed of mercenaries that are paid. So again, if the funding were to stop, this force would dissolve. The US has weaponized the language of peace and, like Salome mentioned, of ceasefire to begin to create diplomatic talks with the RSF and the UAE, at the main provider of arms to the RSF, at the helm of these talks to determine Sudan's fate and what that looks like, and what that would look like if the US were to succeed is a splitting of Sudan and a total control of the resources of the West, and therefore a destabilization of the entirety of Sudan, and who knows, statelessness. We oppose this civil war narrative, the narrative around peace talks that has been bastardized, these words of peace and of humanitarian aid and humanitarian corridors, ceasefires, these words that have been taken over by the US and its allies. So we reject that strategy and those calls.
Yeah, and I wanted to speak a bit more about the sanctions too. So like with the sanctions under Clinton, shortly after the US bombed Al Shifa pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum, they had claimed that it was linked to Osama bin Laden and chemical weapons. So this same rhetoric of this terror, like this so-called war on terror, in which there's no evidence for, right? Just like we see in Somalia, they claim, oh, terrorism, but like the groups that exist are primarily like cultivated by the US and by the very war that they create. And this bombing, it devastated Sudan's health sector, and which was caused by, so when you block the main factory, right, that is creating the pharmaceuticals for a country, it leads to thousands of deaths from diseases that are treatable, right? And the pharmacy isn't just supporting Sudan because no country exists on its own. It's also supporting the region as well. And something to mention too is sanctions are not about people, just like Suad laid out. So the same month, this is fast forwarded to this year, May 2025, the same month that they announced sanctions on Sudan due to so-called chemical weapons is the same month that the US approved 1.5 billion with a B in new arms sales to the United Arab Emirates. As Suad mentioned, this is the same UAE where the weapons where the weapons are from the US are sent through in order to reach Sudan. And so all of this stuff is connected, right? We cannot think about anything happening in this world in isolation. It's all connected to one another. And even Sudan's history goes back further than this. In 1969, Sudan was the first country to have a conference in support of Palestine. And this conference had delegates from like all sorts of movements that were fighting for liberation. They're the first to close their seaports, their airports to Israel. And so it's really important to understand that the colonized people, we understand that our histories are linked, our struggles are linked, our liberations also linked to one another. And sanctions kill. Sanctions sometimes we think about war only in terms of the weaponry that we see, but we also have to think about war and violence as the economic policies, war and violence as folks not having access to basic care. And also war and violence as what just got announced, which feels like it's an announcement every few months, which is that now the Bill Gates Foundation is about to go test IUDs on folks in Kenya, like they do with folks throughout Africa, right? So if we care about reproductive justice, we can't see the politics, the economy, the what's happening with war as a secondary thing. Like reproductive justice is not going to get realized here if we're only thinking about the US. And even when we're thinking about the US, the weapons that they use on us, these are the weapons that they were tired of using abroad and they brought it here and then they exchange it here through these deadly exchange programs through places like Cop City.
That was exactly where I was going to pivot to as we are wrapping up this incredibly substantive discussion. It is what you touched on already, Salome, but why, if others wanted to also answer, why is Sudan so critical to understanding that reproductive justice is inseparable from anti-imperialism and understanding Sudan, advocating for it, and heeding to the calls of action of the Sudanese people? Like, why is that so critical for our collective liberation? If either of you want to go.
Oh, I wanted space for y'all to go since I just spoke. But yeah, Sudan is crucial, right? So much of how we see neocolonialism play out, we see in Sudan. Like one of the things of neocolonialism is let's break down these countries into smaller and smaller pieces. Neocolonialism looks like let's have control, let's have independence on paper, but still control every facet of your life. Neocolonialism looks like let's have these binary partitions of saying, oh, there's a Arab Muslim North and a African Christian South, when like all of these things are cultivated through the colonial process, right? All of these binaries are cultivated for the purpose of maintaining control, for the purpose of divide and rule. And to like you see all of these parallels play in Sudan, all of these things that we talk about when we talk about race, when we talk about class, when we talk about gender. And you also see like the ways in which people come together with our movements historically. And you also see like if we're thinking geographically, the entire region of the Horn of Africa, which is where most of the US Africa command bases, these are military bases, are on the continent. It's all around close to the Red Sea, right? Because they want to control that area. They need to control that area in order to meet their imperialist desires, imperialist dreams. And so, why we must care about Sudan is the same as why we must care about any other place where Black African people are. There's no liberation. There's no liberation that's just us here. There's no liberation that's only Kenya, only Sudan, only Haiti, et cetera. It's all interconnected, and understanding the particulars of these particular spaces allows us to like also see the connections in the general manifestation of imperialism. If we want to think about policing, like they use the same officers to train the Jamaicans as the Nigerians, as the Ugandans, et cetera. And so our common enemy is this imperialist entity of the US. And so if we have a common enemy, and we understand our common enemy, then we're not going to run to them when our people are getting obliterated, right? Instead, we can run to each other and figure that out and build movements and study beyond Instagram infographics, like actually study. Like actually understand the history of how these things came to be so that we do not continue that timeline that I mentioned in the beginning, right? Two campaigns I want to mention. We have the People's Arms Embargo campaign as Sudanese Resistance Front. It's a campaign similar to what the Palestinian Youth Movement is doing, which is trying to stop the supply chain of armaments from the US to the UAE to Sudan. Another campaign that we have is the We Must Plant campaign, which is a campaign that works with farmers in the Gazira region to rebuild that farmland that was used for cotton and have folks actually be able to feed themselves, take care of themselves, have irrigation, etc.
If I could add to Salome this, and I want to, like, with that foundation in mind, I want to give an example in Sudan's history of an issue around reproductive health that is really an indication of how imperialism in the global South works. Many of the NGOs that were white and Western led that came into Sudan initially came to Sudan around this issue of fighting FGM, female genital mutilation. The issue of FGM, the approach that they took was one of, we'll just go in and we, the white Western people, will go in and tell them that this is not right. FGM was not eliminated with that approach. FGM was only eliminated with grassroots Sudanese-led initiatives that were where they had local imams, they had local religious leaders, they had local doctors travel and go meet with people individually, and also through literacy campaigns. There's this this is you wouldn't think, but I mean you would in this space when you understand that at the heart of imperialism at this is imperialism and material needs that need to be met. But when you meet people's material needs, when you feed folks, and when literacy went up, FGM went down. And so local people meeting local needs is what fought FGM, not the large NGOs that had millions and millions of dollars that swept in with all these bright ideas, but the local grassroots campaigns, the African solutions, African problems, is what ultimately helped the society. So I would just urge, and this points to a larger kind of Western framework around swooping in to help the women, or help the femme folk, is like that we need to just go in and save the women, and rather than how do we meet the material needs in which that are keeping these people from, yes, exactly, yeah, they're keeping people from what they, from their needs and their demands. So we just encourage that kind of framework, and would also, in complement to the serfs, would definitely encourage y'all to go join and engage in serfs work. In complement to serfs people's embargo campaign, we have an organizing toolkit, an organizing campaign to complement this our boycott and disrupt toolkit. We always need more researchers, more organizers to help work on this and work and expand this toolkit and the organizing around this. Visit decolonizasudan.org for more information on that. I would just keep it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saad. I will move us into the Q&A portion for 5 minutes or so before we move into some important organizations that we can plug you all into and upcoming events that are similar to this, workshops on connecting reproductive justice. So the first one I will uplift, I think that it was kind of answered in y'all's questions earlier, but if you all feel compelled to answer briefly, the first one is, what role does anti-Blackness play throughout Sudan's history, and how is that manifesting in the current genocide?
Oh my God, that could be a whole other workshop. I think anti-Blackness is very much connected to the concept of just Arab supremacy, Islamization, Islam coming into Sudan. There's so many areas where it manifests. I think it is another part of the white supremacy, the colonization. I would say also very similar to other countries in Africa. It's a brilliant question, and I do think it deserves its own space. And I would say anti-Blackness, but also colorism and tribalism as well.
Similarly, I would say one role that anti-Blackness is playing in the narratives around Sudan is that it is seen as, it's like people are seeing a bunch of Black people fighting, and so they're seen as this internal kind of conflict, because in Africa, there are underlying biases around Africa being somehow backwards, and tribal and conflict has always existed. And so that has prevented a lot of people, these internally or externally manifesting anti-Blackness, has prevented a lot of people from digging into what is actually going on in Sudan, to acting in support of the Sudanese people.
The other question that we had in the chat was, and Dahad briefly answered, but if anyone would like to answer, is Turkey involved in meddling with Sudan? I understand they have been involved in East Africa through peace deals, trade deals, etc.
I can expand upon my original answer in the chat. I will admit I'm not an expert on Turkey's specific and explicit involvement. I do know that a while ago, maybe a couple months ago, there was an article that had come out saying that the president of Turkey's son-in-law, or maybe son, I could be misspeaking, brokered some kind of deal, essentially selling weapons to both the RSF and the SAF. And that's something that you see in a lot of countries. Russia has played a massive role in essentially taking gold in exchange for weapons. And so I would just say, generally speaking, Turkey has aligned itself with where can we stand to benefit, right? In one of these foreign entities, foreign powers. I'm not sure exactly, again, if there is more there. I would also just plug Decolonize Sudan, because they have some really great resources on their website that show various nations and where they have potentially purchased weapons for Sudan in exchange for, and when I say Sudan, I'm obviously talking about these militias and these powers. Arming this genocide is something to look at very closely and to study. Similarly, Israel has also played a role in this situation in Sudan. So all of these imperial powers are playing very active roles.
Yeah, I would reiterate, like the Turkish government has made no formal alliances, but Turkish companies have been amongst some of the main suppliers of arms through the UAE to RSF.
Thank you all so much for sharing all of your knowledge. I am sure everyone else agrees that this is only a starting point, and the resources that they have shared throughout the entire teach-in are going to be really important to look at. I'm going to share my screen briefly to go through some of the next pieces that are coming up. So these are some of the organizations that were mentioned in this workshop. So decolonizedsudan.org cannot be plugged enough. I follow them on Instagram, so you guys should too. I learn a lot from there. And then there's Sudanese Resistance Front. I think the acronym is SURF for that one. Also go follow them on Instagram. And then there's the Real Liberation Collective. Actually, Salome, would you mind talking about the Real Liberation Collective real quick?
Yeah, so it's a group started by me and Brenda here in Atlanta, and we host monthly African film nights, screenings on African film in order to ground ourselves. But in Metro Atlanta, the next screening is August 23rd. We do have a special screening at this concert called Kanami. Kanami is a concert taking place in Atlanta to fundraise for a studio space in Kenya and to support movements taking place in Kenya as well on August 16th. The Eventbrite is linked there, so you can get your tickets. For the 16th, they'll be showing a few films as part of Real Liberation Collective at that event, and there'll be a lot of really great artists as well. So to continuing this work of combining art and political education and movement building.
Amazing, thank you. And then I also wanted to share this infographic from Decolonized Sudan. Saad, if you would like to talk about these pieces, but also you guys can find that on their Instagram page.
Yeah, definitely go check out Declinists Sudan on Instagram and follow. Came as a result of people asking, what are ways that I can support outside of fundraising and providing mutual aid support? That's where this graphic comes from. But there is an ongoing, just to emphasize one thing, Senator Sarah Jacobs has brought a UAE arms embargo bill that is specifically calling for a total arms embargo on the UAE, conditional upon its providing weapons and financing to the RSF militia. This is a very specific bill. We normally do not support U.S. legislation around Sudan because most of the legislation around Sudan calls for U.S. intervention or international intervention into Sudan, which we stand firmly against. But this particular bill is for a unconditional arms embargo on the UAE to disrupt the weapons flow from the UAE. This is exactly what we're needing, American leadership and disruption of the arms, because they are coming from here, most of the arms. I would encourage you to talk to your congresspeople to see if they're supporting this bill that's ongoing, or sign our petition if you want to just have a quick signature. Thanks.
Of course, thank you so much. And then last call to action is just that this campaign is ongoing. It is an opportunity for reproductive justice organizations, mainly abortion funds, to continue talking about anti-imperialism, continue supporting Palestinian liberation, support the liberation of Haiti, Congo, and Sudan. And if you are compelled to continue being involved, you can make a donation here. We have shirts also on sale on our website. I'm actually wearing ours right now. I also wanted to say that your local abortion funds are the people that are making sure people can get their abortion procedures and get their reproductive health needs met. Your abortion funds are supporting people through all of these different barriers. ARC Southeast especially is supporting people with financial and logistical support in order to get their procedures. We serve a pretty large region, and a lot of our region has complete abortion bans or 6-week bans. So it's important to follow up with your local abortion fund. And we also have Midwest Access Coalition in the room. We might have other abortion funds. Shout yourself out if you're in here. I also wanted to plug that ARC Southeast is commemorating Black August, and we have these events. We had the first one this past weekend. We have 2 more virtual ones happening, and then an in-person one in Atlanta. This is a commemoration and reflection in order to honor Black revolutionaries and political prisoners. It's a really important month for us to get involved with our community and support our political prisoners. They just had a letter writing event this past weekend, and there will be a few more. Please let me know if there's anything else. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for attending.